Apple's once iconic music player was killed off by streaming. The iPod, which used to sell over 30 million units per year at its peak, has now been discontinued after selling just 7 million in 2021. And when you think about it, it makes total sense. Who wants to buy an expensive music player that only lets you play songs that you own when you can get access to literally all of the music ever made for just a few bucks a month? And that's exactly what happened. Spotify and Apple Music completely destroyed the iPod. And ironically, Apple was actually the first one to try and release a music streaming service. But unfortunately for them, it didn't work out. In fact, Apple's music streaming service is still not as popular as Spotify's, despite Apple owning the world's most valuable music catalog. So how did Spotify turn the tables on Apple? And why hasn't Apple been able to compete with their music streaming service all these years later? Well, we did some digging, and turns out there are 3 main reasons why Apple failed to compete with Spotify. No, 1. They were too late to the market. Apple tried to enter the streaming market with iTunes Radio back in 2013, but it was far from perfect. You see, the way iTunes Radio worked was that you could choose a song or artist, and then the algorithm would suggest other similar songs. So if you like One Dance by Drake, it might recommend COD and Take My Eyes Off of You by Frankie Valli, because both songs have a similar beat. While this isn't bad, it does have one huge problem, which is that it doesn't take into account your personal taste. That's why people prefer Spotify over iTunes, because if you like One Dance by Drake, it will also recommend other songs that you might like based on your listening history. For example, if you also listen to Uptown Funk by Mark Ronson FT, Bruno Mars, it might recommend another song with a similar funky vibe. But even though Apple's radio was technically worse, they did have one major advantage, which was their massive catalog. See, before launching iTunes Radio, Apple bought up a bunch of music labels and partnered up with the biggest artists in the game, meaning that they had the rights to stream pretty much every song ever made, and that's still the case today. Apple owns the largest music catalog in the industry, with over 90 million songs. In fact, it's so big that they haven't even fully utilized it yet. Despite having the ability to upload 90,000 high-quality lossless tracks, Apple Music only offers 55 million songs to standard users. This move upset a lot of audiophiles who were hoping to use Apple Music to replace their physical CD collection, especially since CDs were becoming more difficult to find as time went on. To make matters worse, Apple didn't offer any sort of offline listening feature until 2016. And even then, it was limited to only 10,000 songs, unless you paid extra for iCloud storage. But even with these setbacks, Apple was confident that they would eventually overtake Spotify because they had something that no other service had: exclusive albums. Exclusive albums are essentially albums that only one streaming service has the rights to stream. This means that if you want to listen to that album, you need to subscribe to that service. A good example of this is Taylor Swift's Fearless Era re-recordings, which are only available on Spotify, meaning that if you're a huge Swiftie, you better have a Spotify premium subscription. This strategy seemed to be working for Apple in the early days because they had managed to secure some of the biggest names in the industry, such as U2, Coldplay, and the Rolling Stones. However, it fell apart when Taylor Swift decided to pull all of her music off of Apple's platform in 2014. This was a huge blow to Apple because Taylor Swift is arguably the biggest name in the industry. So imagine if Messi suddenly decided to stop playing football, or Michael Jordan hung up his basketball shoes. This move caused a huge shift in public opinion and gave Spotify the opportunity to claim the title of the world's largest music streaming service, which they still hold today. Which brings us to our last point: pricing. Apple is known for overpricing their products, and the iPod wasn't an exception. At its peak, the cheapest iPod Nano cost $150, while the cheapest iPod Touch cost $200. And don't forget that you needed to pair these devices with a monthly iTunes subscription fee if you wanted to download new songs. It was definitely convenient, but it was far from cheap. In fact, that same year, 2008, Spotify launched with a freemium model. This means that you could sign up for free and pay for premium features. And although the premium plan costs $9.99 per month, the vast majority of users stuck with the free plan. In fact, there are still over 400 million Spotify users today that don't pay a single cent. Of course, Spotify would love it if these users upgraded, but they aren't forcing their hand by offering an amazing free experience. On the other hand, Apple's pricing structure forced users to upgrade if they wanted to continue enjoying music, whereas Spotify's pricing structure made upgrading optional. So seeing all of this, it seems like Apple made every single mistake that you could possibly make when trying to build a streaming business. And when you think about it, it makes total sense why they failed. Apple is a hardware company at the end of the day. They've simply never been able to compete with pure-play streaming services like Spotify because they were always playing catch-up. But there is one thing that Apple is really good at, which is building ecosystems. The reason why Apple has been so successful over the past decade is because they've built an ecosystem where everyone benefits. Software developers love it because they make loads of money. Hardware users love it because they get high-quality software, and services love it because they get guaranteed distribution. So if Apple had applied the same philosophy to the music streaming market, they probably would have taken over. Let me explain. Instead of signing exclusive deals with artists and music labels, Apple should have formed a partnership with the entire industry. For example, instead of paying Taylor Swift millions of dollars to have her music on their platform, they should have invested into her tour or released a Taylor Swift credit card that offered fans exclusive perks. These investments wouldn't have added a ton of cost for Apple, and they would have been very easy to scale. But here's the thing. Apple could have then bundled these investments as part of an Apple Music subscription, making the whole package feel way more valuable. Something else that they could have done was bundle Apple Music with iCloud storage. If you think about it, it makes total sense for musicians to store their music on iCloud and for their fans to store their videos on iCloud. And it's not like Apple doesn't do bundling. That's how they got Office 365, iMessage, and FaceTime to take off. But instead of taking this approach, Apple took a more eBay approach. They played hardball with the entire industry, which led to tons of lawsuits and bad press. Not to mention this approach hurt consumers because it forced them to pay for the same music multiple times. Artists would sell their music on iTunes. They would pay royalties to the music labels, and then the music labels would turn around and sell the same songs to Apple to put on Spotify. Needless to say, this practice enraged many musicians such as Prince and Taylor Swift, which is why Apple had to change their ways. But it's safe to say that they changed way too late. By the time they started focusing on creating an ecosystem around music, Spotify was already miles ahead. They had established themselves as the market leader, meaning that they had the best algorithms, the best infrastructure, and the best user experience. And the worst part for Apple was that it was almost impossible to catch up because of network effects. Just take a look at Google, Facebook, and Amazon. They all entered the market way earlier than Apple, and they all had way less resources. Yet they've managed to create platforms that nobody can touch. And unfortunately for Apple, they weren't able to create the same sort of network effects with Apple Music. Even though Apple had the best music catalog in the industry, that wasn't enough to convince users to switch. But that brings up an interesting question. What happens to Apple Music now? Are they going to double down on their efforts to compete with Spotify, or will they pivot to focus on something else? Now that they've lost the battle of music, they need to focus on winning the war of living rooms, because as it stands, they're in danger of losing that market as well. Check out this video to learn more. But until then, I'll see you guys on the next one.